You know, when a firearm goes off in a crowded office building, the sound itself is, well, it's not the actual fire.
Right. It's just noise.
Yeah, the siren is just a mechanical screech telling you to get out. But human nature is so strange with this stuff.
Oh, absolutely.
Half the time, we just ignore the alarm. We finish our coffee, we pack up our laptop bags really slowly, assuming it's just a routine drill.
Well, we treat the warning like it's an annoyance rather than, a lifeline.
Yes, but Jonathan Edwards, he saw the actual flames coming. And in 1735, he decided that giving a polite, gentle warning was, it was the cruelest thing he could possibly do to the people sitting right in front of him.
It would have been pastoral malpractice in his eyes.
Spot on. Welcome to Reformed Thinking. Today we're undertaking a comprehensive deep dive into the historical and theological sources of a man who looked at a comfortable, polite congregation and told them they were standing at ground zero of divine wrath.
That is a highly accurate way to set the stage. We are looking at a specific sermon delivered by Edwards in 1735.
Which one?
It's titled, "The Folly of Looking Back and Fleeing Out of Sodom." And our mission for this deep dive is to dissect his severe warnings against spiritual backsliding.
And we are doing this strictly through a Reformed theological framework, right?
Yes, very strictly aligned with the Westminster Confession. We are going to examine how Edwards utilizes physical, historical judgments, like the literal destruction of a city, as direct, tangible types of spiritual realities.
And we want you sitting right here at the table with us for this one. You're going to find out very quickly that Edwards does not pull any punches.
He really doesn't.
But before we get to the terrifying weight of the sermon itself, we have to establish who was actually delivering it. Because the source material provides a detailed biography that, well, it shatters the modern caricatures of the man.
People often picture him as this uneducated, screaming frontier preacher trying to spook people with ghost stories.
Right, like the guy on the street corner with the cardboard sign.
Yeah, but the reality is entirely different. We are talking about a staggering intellect here.
He began studying Latin at age 6.
6 years old, he was tutored by his father and his 4 older sisters.
And didn't he enter Yale when he was, barely a teenager?
Just before turning 13, and he already knew Latin, Greek, and Hebrew by that point.
That is wild.
He graduated with highest honors before his 17th birthday. His intellectual capacity was massive, and it was paired with a significant theological pedigree.
Yeah, his grandfather, right, Solomon Stoddard.
Yes, Stoddard was a titan in New England Puritanism. He pastored the church at Northampton, Massachusetts for 57 years.
Wow.
Edwards eventually became his assistant and then succeeded him. So this was not a man operating on the fringes of society. He was at the absolute center of colonial American intellectual and religious life.
But his life ended pretty abruptly, didn't it? It was a really tragic end.
It was. He took the presidency of Princeton College in 1758, but he died from a smallpox inoculation fever mere weeks later.
Just brutal.
And his death closely followed the deaths of his father and son-in-law. His wife died just 6 months after he did.
Wait, I need to pause here and look at the controversy that happened in the middle of his life, because I think it informs everything we were about to read in this sermon.
The Northampton dismissal.
Yeah. He was dismissed from his own pulpit after 23 years of service. And he was fired because he opposed his own grandfather's practice regarding the Lord's Supper.
That was a huge deal back then.
Stoddard had this practice of allowing unconverted but highly moral individuals to partake in communion. Edwards stood up and said, absolutely not.
Right.
Why was he so rigid on this? How does this strict adherence to biblical discipline reflect the core tenets of Reformed theology?
Well, it goes straight to the heart of how the Westminster Confession defines the visible and invisible church.
Yeah.
And the sacraments themselves.
Okay, break that down for us.
In Reformed theology, the Lord's Supper is a sacrament meant specifically for believers to commune with Christ and be spiritually nourished.
It's for the regenerate.
Right. Stoddard had instituted what was known as the halfway covenant. He viewed the communion table as he called it a converting ordinance.
Meaning what? Like a tool to get people saved?
Yes, meaning he thought it could be used to bring moral, well-behaved people to salvation.
But Edwards wasn't having it.
Not at all. Edwards, relying on strict biblical exposition, recognized that outward morality does not equal a regenerate heart.
Yeah, you can be a nice guy and still be totally lost.
Right. So, to allow the unregenerate to partake was to invite them to eat and drink judgment upon themselves. He was leaning heavily on the Apostle Paul's warning in 1 Corinthians.
And his refusal to compromise on this cost him his job.
It cost him his livelihood, his reputation, and his community. But it demonstrates his conviction that God's ordinances must be protected from human pragmatism.
I think we need a clear picture of how Edwards operated before we read his words today. I like to compare him not to a fiery, unhinged orator trying to scare people for a reaction, but to a clinical, highly educated surgeon, or maybe a physician who is diagnosing a fatal disease.
That's a great way to look at it.
He uses severe language because he believes the disease is real. It's aggressive, and it will kill the patient if left untreated.
Exactly. I mean, he sees the terminal nature of it.
Right. When a doctor looks at your chart and tells you that you have stage 4 cancer, you don't accuse the doctor of being mean.
No, you don't.
You don't get offended by their tone. You understand that the severity of the language matches the severity of the condition.
That analogy captures his methodology perfectly. Following his dismissal from Northampton, he lived on gifts from friends and moved to a small church in Stockbridge, Massachusetts.
He was basically in exile, right?
He was essentially in exile in the wilderness, preaching to Native Americans through an interpreter. And it was in this isolated period that he wrote his most famous theological treatise, Essay on the Freedom of the Will.
Which is incredibly dense and logical.
Very much so. He defended the doctrines of divine foreordination, original sin, and eternal punishment with unmatched philosophical rigor.
And that same methodical, almost architectural structure of his mind is what we're going to see in this 1735 sermon.
He builds his case brick by brick. He does not rely on emotional manipulation. He relies on inescapable logic based on the biblical text.
Let's get into the text then. His clinical precision is immediately evident in how he sets up the verse. He doesn't jump straight to the application. He builds a theological bridge using the concept of typology.
Right, which is crucial here.
The sermon is based on a very short, very blunt verse from Luke chapter 17, verse 32. It's just 3 words. Remember Lot's wife.
A sobering command.
Christ is comparing his coming, both the impending destruction of Jerusalem and his coming at the end of the world, to the days of Noah and the destruction of Sodom.
Christ commands the utmost haste in this passage. He says that the person on the housetop should not come down to take anything out of the house.
Just run.
Just run. And the person in the field should not turn back for their clothes. Edwards locks onto the sense of extreme urgency.
Because Jerusalem was devoted to destruction by special divine wrath, just like Sodom.
Yes. Therefore, the command to flee without looking back is identical to the command the angel gave to Lot.
But, hold on, when Edwards talks about Sodom here, is he just using it as a scary metaphor? Like a preacher trying to spook his congregation with a historical horror story?
Not at all.
We need to unpack the Reformed understanding of typology as Edwards uses it. Escaping the unbelieving city of Jerusalem is a type of escaping a state of unbelief. Escaping Sodom is a type of fleeing from a natural state of sin. Why does this specific framework carry so much weight?
It carries immense weight because, in a Reformed theological framework, historical events are not random occurrences. God is sovereign over every detail of history.
Right, the Westminster Confession teaches that God ordains whatsoever comes to pass.
Yes, and because God orchestrates history, physical judgments literally foreshadow spiritual wrath. Typology is not just a literary device.
It's not a metaphor created by a clever preacher.
No, it is a divine pattern written into the fabric of time. The physical city of Sodom, with its real fire and real brimstone, was designed by God to be a tangible historical preview of the eternal state of unregenerate humanity.
Wow. So fleeing the physical city is the historical shadow.
And fleeing from the natural state of sin to Christ is the spiritual reality.
So what does this mean for you, listening right now? Does focusing so heavily on the impending doom of a physical city risk making you miss the spiritual urgency of fleeing to Christ?
How do you mean?
Well, Edwards calls Christ the mountain of safety.
Yeah.
But I could see someone getting so caught up in the historical trivia of fire raining down on a Bronze Age city that they forget it's actually a mirror being held up to their own face.
Oh, Edwards anticipates that very risk. He uses the historical horror story to awaken the deadened senses of his congregation.
Because we're so attached to the physical world.
Right. He knows that human beings comprehend physical pain much easier than we comprehend spiritual danger.
If I see a fire, I run. If I hear about spiritual wrath, I might just yawn.
Exactly. By painting the physical destruction of Sodom with such terrifying clarity, he is grabbing the listener by the collar. He's essentially saying, if you would run in absolute terror from physical fire raining from the sky, how much more urgently should you run from the spiritual wrath of a holy God?
It's the necessary entry point.
It forces an awakening to the spiritual reality.
Okay, so Edwards has established that Sodom represents the natural, sinful state of humanity. Now he acts like a diagnostician breaking down the anatomy of an accursed city.
He lays out several arguments detailing why one must flee without looking back.
Yeah, let's go through them. He starts by diagnosing the pollution of the city itself. He calls it a rendezvous for unclean spirits and devils. But here is where he turns the knife.
This part is brilliant.
He states that some people in Sodom may seem to carry a fair face and make a fair outward show. But if we could look into their hearts, they are everyone altogether filthy and abominable.
That phrase perfectly encapsulates the Westminster Confession's doctrine of total depravity.
And we need to be very clear about what total depravity means in Reformed theology, because people misunderstand it constantly.
Oh, all the time. It does not mean utter depravity. It does not mean that every person is as thoroughly evil in their actions as they could possibly be.
Right, you can have a secular person who loves their kids, gives to charity, and obeys the speed limit.
Yes. Total depravity means that sin has corrupted every single part of human nature, the mind, the will, and the affections.
It's completely pervasive.
So the outward show of morality does nothing to change the fundamental pollution of the heart before a holy God. Those good deeds are not done out of a supreme love for God's glory.
Let me try to make that relatable. Think of the fair face of an unconverted person, like a freshly painted house that has a completely rotted, termite-infested foundation.
Oh, that's a solid visual.
You walk by this house in your neighborhood, it looks pristine. The lawn is perfectly manicured, the trim is a crisp white, the windows are spotless. But the structural collapse is already guaranteed because the joists are basically sawdust.
The paint job does not fix the rot.
Right. It just hides it from the neighbors. Edwards is looking at his congregation and telling them that their polite society manners, their colonial respectability, and even their outward religious duties are just a fresh coat of paint on a rotting foundation.
That is a highly accurate illustration of his point. The outward appearance is completely irrelevant to the impending collapse.
It changes nothing about the final result.
Right. And this leads directly to his next major point concerning the nature of the judgment against this accursed state. Edwards warns that the city is appointed to destruction by an immutable, irreversible decree from a holy God.
Let's talk about the gravity of that phrase, irreversible decree.
He leans heavily on the absolute sovereignty of God here. The Westminster Confession states that God's decrees are his eternal purpose according to the counsel of his will.
Meaning there is no negotiating. Once the decree is issued, the city's fate is sealed.
Precisely. When God determines to pour out his justice on a state of sin, there is no appeal process. The decree is immutable.
God's holiness requires that he be a consuming fire to such uncleanness.
And the certainty of the decree is what necessitates the absolute haste and fleeing. If the decree could be changed, or if God could be bargained with, then lingering might be an option.
You could just stay in the city and try to negotiate terms with the angels.
But because the decree is irreversible, the only sane response is immediate forceful flight.
Furthermore, Edwards describes the destruction as exceedingly dreadful. Fire within and without, with no drop of water.
And he notes that it is universal. No by-corner offers safety, and no age or condition is spared.
The horror of the judgment is magnified by how unexpected it is. Edwards shifts from the certainty of the doom to the suddenness of it.
Yes, the timing.
He points out that the destruction of Sodom happened on a fair morning with no clouds. Lot's sons-in-law were making merry. They were laughing at Lot for being an alarmist. This is one of the most chilling psychological tactics Edwards uses.
The psychological shock of the fair morning is one of his most brilliant rhetorical moves. He notes that the inhabitants of Sodom expected no such thing.
They were just planting, building, buying, and selling.
The weather was perfect. Edwards uses the mundane nature of daily life to make the sudden arrival of divine wrath infinitely more terrifying.
Because judgment doesn't always announce itself with dark clouds, thunder, and ominous signs in the sky.
Often it arrives on a bright, sunny Tuesday, when everyone is going about their normal business. The sheer normalcy of the morning makes the suddenness of the destruction devastating.
I mean, think about the weather report in Sodom that morning. Blue skies, perfect conditions for farming. And then, without warning, the sky opens up with fire.
It's a terrifying thought.
Edwards also notes that the destruction is everlasting. He points out that the Dead Sea acts as a physical type of the eternal lake of fire.
He argues there is nothing worth looking back upon because the enjoyments are literally perishing in the flames.
And he highlights that we are warned by messengers from God. But here is where it gets really interesting for me. I want to question the mindset of Lot's wife.
Let's look at her.
Edwards notes that she lived in a place of outward plenty. The biblical text mentions the soil about Sodom was exceedingly fruitful, like the garden of God.
It was a very comfortable place to live.
So was her fatal flaw an active, fist-raising rebellion against God? Was she shouting curses at the angels? Or was it just a passive, lingering attachment to comfort? I mean, she was leading a very nice life.
Edwards argues it was the latter, and that is what makes her example so insidious and relevant. Her sin was an affection for the things of the world over obedience to the command of God.
She just hankered after the pleasant things she left behind.
It wasn't necessarily that she loved the extreme, notorious wickedness of Sodom. She loved the ease, the security, the fruitful soil, and the plenty.
Which brings us to the Reformed understanding of idolatry.
Right. In Reformed thought, idolatry is not just bowing down to a golden calf in the desert. It is having your affections captivated by the created world rather than the Creator.
So her passive, lingering attachment was a lethal indictment of where her heart truly resided.
Yes.
That is the terrifying part for you listening today. Passive idolatry. You do not have to be an outright villain to be destroyed. You just have to love your comfort more than you love God.
A very sobering reality.
Okay, so Edwards has painted this terrifying historical picture of a doomed city and a woman who looked back at her comfortable life. But he is speaking to polite 18th century churchgoers in New England.
He has to bring it home.
Right. How does he cross that bridge? How does he look at a baker or a farmer sitting in the pew and say, "You are actually standing in Sodom"?
He executes what we can call the pastoral pivot. He takes the historical analysis and turns it into a mirror for his congregation.
He divides the entire world into two distinct cities, doesn't he?
Yes. Zion, the Church of God, and Sodom, the accursed city. There is no middle ground whatsoever.
No suburbs.
No suburbs. He tells his listeners that if they are out of Christ, Sodom is their nativity. They were born there.
And here's the crazy part. He groups highly moral, reformed-looking citizens into the exact same society as, I'm going to quote him directly here, fornicators and drunkards and adulterers and common swearers and highwaymen, pirates, and sodomites.
It's a shocking list.
Wow. He puts a well-dressed colonial citizen who pays his taxes in the same spiritual category as a violent pirate. I want you to pause and consider how offensive this doctrine would be to a modern audience today.
Oh, people would walk out of the church.
We love to rank sins. We love to put ourselves in the category of mostly good people. We look at criminals and say, well, I am definitely not like them.
It's a natural human defense mechanism.
To be told that your best, most charitable day still places you in the same spiritual city as a pirate is a massive blow to human pride. How does Edwards justify this from a theological standpoint?
It relies heavily on the Reformed doctrine of imputation. According to the Westminster Confession, the only righteousness that can stand before the blinding holiness of God is the perfect, spotless righteousness of Jesus Christ, imputed to the believer by faith.
Which means any righteousness generated by human effort is useless.
The prophet Isaiah describes it as filthy rags. Therefore, the moral behavior seen in an unregenerate person is not due to any inherent saving goodness.
Then where does the morality come from?
Edwards attributes their morality to God's greater restraints.
Wait, what does he mean by greater restraints?
It means that God, in his providence, restrains the evil of some people for the sake of societal order.
Oh, I see. God prevents the polite citizen from acting out the full depravity of their heart so that society can actually function.
Yes. But their underlying nature, their spiritual DNA, remains identical to the highwaymen.
The pirate acts out his rebellion violently. The polite citizen acts out his rebellion quietly by trusting in his own good works rather than Christ.
Both are in rebellion against the king. Both are citizens of Sodom.
But why does Edwards believe this massive offense is entirely necessary? I mean, why intentionally insult the people you are trying to save?
The offense is necessary because as long as a person believes they possess some inherent goodness, they will never truly flee to Christ.
If you think you're safe, you won't run.
Right. If you think you are living in a slightly flawed but generally safe city, you will not run for your life. You might try to clean up the streets a bit or, paint your house, but you will not flee to the mountains.
You have to be completely stripped of your self-righteousness.
You have to realize that you are standing in ground zero of divine wrath. Edwards shatters their moral pride because it is the only way to induce the absolute desperation required to flee to the mountain of safety without looking back.
That makes perfect sense. If you don't know the building is on fire, you will not use the fire escape.
Exactly.
Having identified the listener's true location as Sodom, Edwards proceeds to escalate the stakes by contrasting the physical judgment of the past with the spiritual judgment of the future.
He argues that hell is infinitely more dreadful than literal Sodom.
And he uses this incredible rhetorical device. He says physical fire is but a shadow or painted fire compared to the reality of divine wrath.
We really must focus heavily on that phrase, painted fire. It is a brilliant concept.
Unpack that for us.
Edwards argues that everything we know of physical pain, burning, and destruction is just a picture. It's a two-dimensional representation.
Like a painting on a wall.
Think of a canvas with a painting of a raging campfire. If you touch the canvas, it cannot burn you. It's just oil and cloth. It only gives you an idea of what fire looks like.
Okay, I follow you.
Edwards is suggesting that the literal fire and brimstone that rained down and destroyed Sodom was merely the physical painting of the spiritual reality of hell.
Wait, so the most horrific physical pain a human can even imagine is just a drawing compared to the real thing?
Yes. The spiritual wrath of the Almighty upon the soul is so vastly superior in its terror that physical fire seems harmless by comparison.
Wow.
The physical judgment is just the shadow cast by the eternal judgment.
And Edwards pairs this with another terrifying thought. He asserts that those who reject the gospel bear far greater guilt than the inhabitants of literal Sodom.
Because of the amount of light they've been given.
Right. The people of Sodom sinned against the light of nature. But the people in Edwards's congregation are sinning against the clear light of the gospel.
They have the Bible, they have the warnings, and yet they still linger.
Which brings up the terrifying urgency of exhausted patience. Edwards warns that God's patience has an absolute limit.
He notes that multitudes are seized by wrath while they delay, just as Lot's wife was immediately destroyed when she looked back.
I want to look closely at the biblical text here. God physically dragged Lot and his wife out of the city. The text specifically says, the Lord being merciful to her.
He gave her a huge advantage.
He gave her a head start. He pulled her by the hand. Yet the moment she looked back, that patience ended instantly. Let's discuss the reformed view of God's common grace here and how it can be suddenly withdrawn.
Common grace is the unmerited favor God gives to all people. It is what causes the rain to fall on the just and the unjust.
It keeps the world running.
It prevents the world from becoming as evil as it could be, and it delays immediate judgment to allow time for repentance. Edwards points out that God exercised immense common grace with Lot's wife.
Angels pressed her, dragged her, and set her safely outside the city limits.
She experienced a high degree of divine favor. But there is a line. When a person continually abuses that grace, resisting the drawing of the Spirit and hankering after the world, God is entirely just to withdraw that restraining grace.
And when the patience ends, it doesn't taper off slowly.
No, when the patience ends, the judgment is instantaneous. Multitudes, Edwards warns, have been suddenly seized by the storm of wrath while they were busy delaying, assuming they always had more time.
The physical consequence for Lot's wife was becoming a pillar of salt. But Edwards does not leave it as just a weird historical artifact.
He spiritualizes it.
He translates this physical punishment into the psychological and spiritual mechanics of a backsliding heart. He argues that stopping to look back ensures you never get any further.
The soul becomes dead and hard, like the pillar of salt.
He discusses how backsliders quench the spirit, lose convictions, and give Satan an advantage. This leads to the tragedy of watching others flee successfully to the mountain of safety, which the Bible calls Zoar, while remaining behind.
Let's analyze the concept of a spiritual pillar of salt. When a person is awakened to their sin, they experience spiritual convictions. They feel fear.
They start to actually flee.
Yes. They might start attending church regularly, reading their Bible, and avoiding obvious sins. But when they look back, when they pause to reconsider the pleasures of their sin, they quench the work of the Spirit.
And what happens then?
Edwards explains that losing spiritual convictions hardens the heart. The soul becomes stupefied.
So it is actually worse for them than if they had never sought salvation at all.
Absolutely. They become immune to the warnings. They sit in the pews hearing the same sermons about wrath and grace, but they feel nothing.
Their souls are as rigid and lifeless as a pillar of salt.
They are monuments of wrath taking up space in the middle of the church. They see others running to Christ, finding peace and safety, but they themselves are frozen. They're unable to move forward because their affections are tied to the city behind them.
And Edwards also warns that backsliding during a time of great spiritual light seals damnation, similar to the Israelites wanting to return to Egypt after seeing the miracles at the Red Sea.
The more light you reject, the harder the heart gets.
Wait, is Edwards saying that a single moment of doubt seals a person's fate?
Right.
Because we all have moments of hesitation or temptation.
Sure.
I need to clarify what kind of looking back creates this permanent spiritual paralysis. Is it one bad day, or is he describing a systemic turning away from grace?
Edwards is not talking about the genuine struggles, doubts, and daily repentance of a true believer who is actively fighting their sin.
Okay, good. That's a relief.
He is describing a systemic, willful turning away. It is a choice to harbor a cherished sin, a refusal to completely forsake the world.
So it's a deliberate posture.
Yes. The backslider he describes is someone who was drawn by convictions, perhaps purely out of a fear of hell, but never actually had their underlying affections changed by the Holy Spirit.
So when the immediate fear of the fire subsides, their natural gravity pulls them back to what they truly love.
It is the systemic withdrawal of the heart from God to the world.
Edwards concludes his warning by exposing how subtly and quietly this spiritual paralysis takes hold. It is not always a loud, fist-shaking rebellion.
No, it's often very quiet.
He observes that the state of the world is ripe for some great revolution and judgment. The cry has reached heaven. But then he brings it down to the individual level.
Right, to the human heart.
He states that the human heart is naturally a backsliding heart. When under conviction, fleeing is a mere force because God is dragging them, but their natural gravity pulls them back towards Sodom.
And then he uses this devastating medical analogy.
Yes. He calls backsliding a flattering distemper that works like a consumption.
We need to spend significant time on this consumption analogy because it is terrifying in its historical context.
In the 18th century, a consumption referred to tuberculosis, right?
Yes, it was a wasting disease of the lungs, and it was a massive killer in colonial New England. What made it so terrible was its deceptive nature.
How so?
The victim would slowly waste away over months or years, but they often felt they were getting better. They would have days of high energy, a flush in their cheeks, and they would flatter themselves that they were recovering right up until the moment they died.
I have read about that. They called it the sensible recovery. The patient would suddenly feel great, they would make plans for the future, and their family would rejoice.
And then they would collapse and die the next day.
Edwards takes this physical horror and applies it directly to the soul.
He does. People flatter themselves that they're still seeking God, that they haven't entirely lost their convictions while they are actually spiritually dying.
Because backsliding steals on people insensibly.
Right. They compromise in small areas. They skip prayer, they entertain a worldly affection, they make peace with a minor sin, and they tell themselves, I am still a seeker, I am still fleeing to the mountain.
They blind themselves to their own disease.
By the time they realize their convictions are gone, their heart has become so hard that they no longer care. They die of the spiritual consumption while convincing themselves they are on the road to health.
This is why Edwards highlights that fleeing requires constant, forceful pressing forward. The natural tendency of the fallen heart is always to slide backward.
Gravity always pulls you down.
Think about the gravity of this for a second. The greatest danger you face might not be outright vocal rejection of the truth.
You might not be shaking your fist at the sky or writing anti-religious books.
Exactly. Your greatest danger is the quiet, gradual, and insensible slipping away into comfort. It is the slowing down. It is the assumption that you can linger on the plains instead of running to the mountain.
Edwards forces us to realize that lingering is just a slower way to die in the fire.
And that ties together his core thesis seamlessly. Edwards constructs a terrifying logical bridge from the physical destruction of Sodom to the spiritual peril of the backsliding heart.
Every historical detail is leveraged here. The suddenness of the morning, the irreversible decree, the absolute devastation, the pillar of salt.
He uses all of it to explain the hidden mechanics of the soul. To look back is to desire the things appointed for wrath.
It demonstrates that the heart is still native to Sodom and remains foreign to Zion.
The goal here was not simply to terrify the colonial citizens of Massachusetts. Edwards's goal, and our goal in looking at this material today, is to sever every earthly attachment that prevents a full flight to Christ.
Christ is the true mountain of safety.
He shakes the listener violently because he sees the painted fire giving way to the terrible reality.
I will leave you with a final thought to consider that builds on the theological framework we have established today.
Let's hear it.
Edwards calls Lot's wife a durable pillar and monument of wrath. Since Edwards views physical events as shadows of spiritual realities, we must ask ourselves about our present condition.
What should we be asking?
Could our modern-day distractions, our lingering attachments to comforts, and our quiet daily compromises be constructing an invisible internal pillar of salt right now? Could we be freezing our spiritual state into a monument of apathy, completely unnoticed by the outside world, long before any final judgment arrives?
That is the heavy question we have to reckon with. When the alarm sounds, do you finish your coffee or do you run? Thank you for joining us for this deep dive into the historical and theological sources. We will see you next time on Reformed Thinking.